Howdy. The video's a little late and I apologize for that. I've been busy grading midterms. So let's talk about the midterms. Overall, I was extremely impressed with many of the exam answers. I was very impressed by the comparison you did between NIST that I usually emphasize and other ways to approach risk assessment and risk management, to the point that that should be our next topic and will be our next topic, but you've actually given me some more information to work with. I did want to get back to you on the slides I posted earlier this week for cybersecurity risk assessment regarding cost. And I will start out with this observation. It is an extremely difficult topic. There is no good way to assess the cost of risk. And we talk about, let's say, what happened with Facebook with Cambridge Analytica. They broke no federal law. They didn't do anything when they allowed Cambridge Analytica to scrape data and use that data. What they did do is they breached the trust with their customers and clients, although we could argue that since Facebook does not charge, we're not really customers or clients. How did we think Facebook was making their money? People like to call it a social media company. It's not. It's a data company. It stores, processes, uses, and sells our data. So while there was no law broken, put yourself in the shoes of whoever would have done a risk assessment for Facebook to say, let's say 3 or 4 years ago, what are the risks associated with breach of trust? What are the risks associated with not violating a law, but doing an activity as a corporation that undermines how you are viewed in the market? So Facebook lost $5 billion in value. That's significant just from the Cambridge Analytica activity. So that was very significant. However, my point in this isn't if they're right or wrong or if we should have laws. My point in this is, how do we account for this in risk assessment? If you were the vice president in charge of risk for Facebook, how would you have accounted for this? And this is the entire problem with cost models. We all want cost models, but we don't know how to include that in predicting risk. Let's think about Stuxnet in 2010. It brought down the Iranian nuclear program. It changed our whole thinking of how we look at security for industrial control systems. Yet at the same time, they had never assessed the risk of a USB stick being used to perpetrate an attack with that type of magnitude and consequences. And neither had anyone else. It was only after the mechanics of Stuxnet became known that we began to ban USB sticks. Shamoon, same problem. You brought down the largest corporation in the world. A hacker brought this down. Shamoon was a nation-state attack on Aramco, Saudi Aramco, which is the largest corporation in the world. ExxonMobil's dwarfed it by that. Brought that down something like 30,000 PCs, brought them down and significantly impacted their operations for a couple of weeks. And when we look at this, we don't think about how we can put that in risk, because one of the consequences of Shamoon was that it escalated the nation states of Saudi Arabia and Iran to go against each other and flood the market with oil. That's why Saudi Arabia later flooded the market with oil. And I have a mistake on this. It should say any big attack on critical infrastructure. Any big attack on critical infrastructure is the same. We can figure out the immediate physical cost of the attack, but we cannot figure out or predict the cost associated with the intangibles. So before we get into this discussion, let's just go back and review some basics. Risk is the possibility or probability of suffering a loss. Okay? In our assessments, we are to examine and measure and analyze and provide answers. We need to assess the risks to know how best to avoid, to accept, to transfer, to mitigate. And we have to know, to do that, what the nature of the threats are. Any circumstance or event with a potential to cause harm to an asset. These are all old terms to you, but I want you to begin to think of them now in the context of evaluating risk and coming up with what we call a cost-benefit analysis. So when we talk about this, we look, how do you put a dollar sign on risk? Now, we can talk about how much a risk assessment is going to cost. I'm going to take 6 people. They're going to work for so many weeks or so many months or so many years. I'm going to have this kind of support. I'm going to have this kind of travel. I can come up with how much that cost reasonably. All good programs have to be kept on schedule and budget. But what the question becomes is, how much value does a risk assessment provide? And how do we measure that value? How do we know that? And here's why this becomes important. We have to sell the notion of conducting risk assessments, and as we'll see in the next couple of weeks when we talk about privacy, conducting privacy impact assessments. We have to do a cost-benefit analysis. This is what runs our enterprises, our universities, our not-for-profits. Everybody wants to know, what's the cost-benefit? I'm going to put so much money as an investment. What am I going to come out? What am I going to gain for it? And sometimes it's very difficult to say, just avoiding this issue is worth this much money. We know how much it costs to do the risk assessment. We can look immediately at the immediate impact. If it let's say destroys critical infrastructure, has to replace 30,000 computers like Aramco, they can figure all that out. But how do you predict the value of doing the risk assessment or the consequences if you don't take certain issues and aspects into account? So our goal in a cost-benefit analysis, if you haven't had a business class, is to determine for us how much to spend on cybersecurity. If I said I can spend $10 million and I'll get you 95% secure, I can spend $25 million and get you 98% secure. Well, the difference between 95 and 98% secure, or whatever numbers you want to pick with, depends on the industry and what you're trying to protect. So we can start, when we do a cost-benefit analysis, start with what we know. For instance, we know if we violate HIPAA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley or an FTC consent order, as Facebook did do under Cambridge Analytica, that there's going to be statutory fines. So we can say, this is what you're going to have to pay if this bad thing happens, okay? But we have to look, first of all, and let's go back to the basics. Do all data breaches have a significant economic impact on the enterprise? And if so, how do we assess that? So our traditional cost-benefit analysis looks at the accounting. Is it an operating cost or a capital investment? Because accounting rules are different. And this sounds like, wait a minute, why are we talking about this? I want to be in cybersecurity. Well, here's the difference. If it's a capital investment, the company has to depreciate that, let's say, over a number of years. So they're having to come up with the cash to pay for something that they don't get the benefit of a tax break. Maybe it takes 10 years or 5 years or whatever. If it's an operating cost, they can deduct that cost immediately. So they can look at that as an accounting, because you're always going to have accountants come in and give you the implications, because you talk about cost-benefit analysis, you talk about cash flow, you talk about tax implications. This is part of the equation. We look at it from a technical viewpoint. We say, what are our costs? What are our goals? Well, our goal is to protect CIA. And how do we do that? And if so, how much? How do we protect that confidentiality, integrity, and availability? And then we were faced with this cost savings, how to determine, is it direct or indirect cost? Is it tangible versus intangible cost? We look at this both from doing the risk assessment and then the consequences of providing a risk assessment that protects and of providing a risk that avoids these costs, and at the same time to provide the value, the risk assessment for what if we don't do it, or what if we don't account for something, as Cambridge Analytica did. So we don't have it, loss of reputation, that's the intangibles, loss of goodwill with your customers, lost opportunities, these are all intangibles. Think of it as your own life. You took a risk to come to Texas A&M. It's going to cost you a certain amount of money. And when you have that, you are risking what you're putting your career on. Now, you could have chosen other possible things to study, and they might have been just as interesting and you might have done just as well, but you picked cybersecurity, you picked computer science, you picked engineering, you picked business, you picked whatever you picked and selected, and typically it'll be based on, look, I'm going to invest this much in my education. I need to come out and know I have a job, and I need to know that job's going to be well paying, that it's going to pay off. Well, what about the lost opportunity? What if you had majored in something else and made a great invention? I mean, we don't know, right? We can't predict the future. We can't predict the cost of all paths not taken. We have the same problem in doing a cost-benefit analysis. It's hard to say, well, if we hadn't been in this data breach and it cost us all these tens of millions of dollars, we would have exploited an opportunity that would have made our company more profitable. Or we couldn't predict what would happen when we lost business. Or we couldn't predict, as Target, as Home Depot, as these big breaches, that when people think of Target or say Target, many times they're thinking about the data breach. Those are the tangible and intangible cost. Now, I've gotten some sources here, and a few years ago I was found out about Gordon Loeb, this book, and I've reviewed the book before I made these slides, and the problem is it was written in 2007, 2008. After I first read the book, I went back and thought, when I first bought it, I thought, oh, I got an old edition. It's never been updated. I can find some academic articles. I'm not going to force you to read those. There's different approaches, but they tend to be old because we are grappling as an industry with this tough problem of how do we assess cost. One of my students last spring said, we don't talk much about cost. We don't talk much about a cost-benefit analysis and how to sell this to management. And I'm like, you're directly on point, because I like to present you with factual information and not a hand-waving. And too much of this is still in the hand-waving stage. You'll see more traditional sources use something called single loss expectancy. It's a mathematical formula. And so you can say this is a probability of something happening, this has happened here, we can have an annual loss expectancy, we can look at the hard facts, we know it's going to cost, we're going to have to replace equipment, we're going to have recovery time, and we're going to have penalties, and we know we're going to lose this lost revenue. And this is, again, incorporated into these mathematical equations. However, again, we have intangibles that are unknown that we're not putting into these equations. And I list the Maersk case trade-off here. Maersk, when they had the ransomware attack, made a business decision to actually slow their restoration process up, because they were going to upgrade their systems 3 months down the line. And when they hit with ransomware, as a business decision, they first of all prioritized what part of their business had to come back up to keep them in business. And then secondly, they went through and said, we're going to spend more time now and upgrade our systems rather than bring all the systems up and upgrade them in 3 months. So there was this trade-off. So the recovery time was actually longer once they got their priorities systems back up. Maersk is the largest container company in the world. We bring Maersk down totally. We're not going to have food. We're not going to have parts. We're going to have a disruption in the supply chain. You can see Maersk, it's big in maritime. You can see Maersk containers on the back of trucks and everything. So again, this was a business decision. They said, hey, we're going to take more time to recover, because at the end, it's smarter for the business. Even in the short term, we're going to eat more cost. So our whole idea of the cost-benefit analysis is to identify those costs and benefits by first identifying them and putting costs to those assets. Do we repair them? Do we replace them? But then we have these other assets, and this is what I want you to get out of this lecture. Goodwill, reputation. This is intangible, but it is part of a company's assets. When we are in a data business, when we are in these intangibles, then, like Facebook, what's their actual physical value worth is one thing, but what about the value of the other assets? Their goodwill in the community, in the tech community, with their clients, in the stock market? What about their reputation? this is, again, can we do it? And then we add to this lost opportunity cost. Let's say Cambridge Analytica had never occurred. What would Facebook be doing now instead of spending a lot of time trying to recover from what's a PR disaster? So I've talked about this single loss expectancy and this annual loss expectancy. And, if I sound a little cynical, I think this is based on the 1970s methodology. You assign a probability for each risk. You ran this. I love mathematics as much as the next person, but when you have too many unknowns and too many variables, you may have a good estimate, but it's not going to be valid. And until we break through this barrier through cybersecurity research, and I don't know how that's going to happen. Is it going to be through data analytics? Is it going to be through, AI techniques, machine learning? I don't know. But we are basically trying to predict our cost, trying to build our cost-benefit analysis, trying to assess this using technology that has not kept up with the reality of data breaches. So what changed? The technology. Our recognition of the inability to predict foreseeable consequences, or maybe they're not foreseeable, but reputation, loss of goodwill, opportunity cost. You're beginning to hear these words. We need to change our traditional models, which are based on a rigorous mathematical approach, yay for math, but we need to figure out a good way so we can derive the optimal amount to spend for the best payback. Because again, we miss risk, we miss cost, and this has business complications. So we talked about risk, we talk about risk metrics, and I'm going to leave you with this. The problem with these, again, we cannot determine the expected value of losses. Sorry, I flipped out of that too quickly. Let's go to the summary slide. We talk about this, the problems with these models, the expected value of losses, the probability of a loss, the probability of the largest loss. What's the worst thing that could happen, right? What are those black swan events? The variance of loss. And so I'm going to leave you with a blank slide that says, where do we go from here? I don't know. I may teach this differently in 2 years and 5 years and whatever. However, where do we go from here is we need to start building a methodology for assessing the true cost based on the problems and issues I have presented here. Thank you for your time. I will talk about the paper in a separate video. Thank you.